Michael, what keeps you up at night? What's the sort of top non-traditional security threat?
It's very similar to what Ottilia has just mentioned. I feel that food security is indeed one of the gravest challenges for two reasons. In military conflicts and national security environments, we have a cyclical version of conflicts accelerating but then eventually decreasing. Because of climate change and the linearity of climate going into the wrong direction, the food security impacts are going to be exacerbated in the foreseeable future, and it's only going to go into one direction. And in conjunction with that development, we see a new quality or weaponization of food that I feel is really important to understand for us here at the Munich Security Conference. Ukraine is the exhibit A. What Russia has done by targeting the Ukrainian agriculture infrastructure, bombing seed factories, mining fields, closing ports, had ripple effects, specifically in Eastern Africa, was driving more people into starvation, so that food security has been used as a long-range weapon by the Russians that is likely to create more victims thousands of kilometers or miles away from the battlefield than on the battlefield in Ukraine. And I feel that requires new strategic thinking about the convergence of development, agriculture, climate, and national security conversations, and also ideas about new deterrences.
Great, thanks very much. Kira, you're less food-oriented, more climate. What keeps you? What's worrying you?
Yeah, exactly these combined effects that we are seeing, that all crises, may they be economic crises, may they be wars, they're happening against the backdrop already of a changed climate. And therefore, we're seeing these aggravations. We are seeing situations where people are being displaced because of conflict, but also because of climate change, because countries that have faced this instability, they're not as well equipped to adapt to a changing climate and to storms, floods, droughts, etc. So this is what we saw, for example, in Derna in Libya, where the devastation was massive, also because of lack of adaptation investments, corruption, etc. So we are seeing these combined effects. And on the medium time horizon, we are also seeing large changes in the Earth system that may contribute to a disintegration of our global food systems. And this is what worries me most.
Great, thanks very much. The elephant in the room is, I guess, the shutdown of USAID in the United States. What impact does that have on the areas that you watch, and where are you looking for? Is Europe going to step in, or is it just, or is this money sort of irreplaceable? That there is going to be a dramatic impact on those countries and on the security situation around them? Go ahead.
Speaking now, not only Southern Africa, but the rest of the continent as well, what we are already seeing is a number of smaller projects, some of which were exclusively funded by USAID, effectively having to shut down or having a great degree of uncertainty. Now, a lot of them have been reassured that it's just 90 days, we're reevaluating. These are not USAID staff. These are people that are implementing programs funded by the US State Department. And their big question is, can I wait for 3 months? In my earlier input, I spoke to livelihoods, right? If you are earning an income, particularly in some of the most unequal countries in the world, the idea that you can go for 3 months without certainty on when you will get paid or if you will get paid after that, that creates a lot of tensions and a lot of generally uncertainty and instability within the communities.
So you're talking to staff actually who are administering these programs.
So that's part of it. The second, which is they are implementing some life-changing programs. So for example, a lot of the major funding goes towards health. In Southern Africa, you see funding for HIV/AIDS, for example, a region that was devastated in the 90s into the early 2000s by HIV/AIDS, not knowing when next they can actually be able to have life-saving medication. Now, they're not the sole funder. And I think the question that you posed around who can be able to plug some of these gaps, I would argue, I'm speaking in Munich, so I'll say Europe as well, but I also think particularly coming out of African countries themselves, the strategizing around the role of the Africa Center for Disease Control, ensuring that partnerships, particularly with the private sector, are actually stimulated better. You cannot wait in a space of uncertainty when people are literally dying. You have to have the right kind of partnerships, the right kind of strategies to address a gap that you did not foresee.
Great. Michael?
Yes, I think it's dramatic. USAID has a volume of over $40 billion, or had. I think we have to speak in the past tense about USAID because it's not going to come back. And that's difficult to replace. I hope there will be coalitions of the willing, among them European, Asian, and Pacific countries, and maybe also some of the rising countries in the South that will step up and take greater responsibility. COP30 in Brazil will be the test case as to whether that is happening. I feel the impact is dramatic also because food security is data-based. It's a very complex issue. It's about seeds, it's about agriculture, regional stability, trade routes, climate change, supply chains. And the problem is that the trade and the seed markets are both heavily concentrated. You just had the CEO of Bayer here. And the ecosystem that development funds provided in terms of figuring out how to diversify seeds that grow under different conditions in different regions and are climate proof, seeds that are diverse enough to withstand either attacks on the food system in terms of bioterrorism or withstand dramatically changing climate are very important. That ecosystem has been mostly funded through development money. Lots of it came from USAID, and the consequences for high-end databases, seed development, seed banks is going to be dramatic. It's underestimated of how important they are for our collective well-being, and it will be very important to figure out very quickly of how to replace those funds that have gotten lost.
Kira?
Climate change will continue to undercut traditional livelihoods, and this then can lead to the fact that hunger crises are aggravated. And as we are seeing USAID funds halted and most likely permanently cut, there's a vacuum that will be there. The question is, who will fill this vacuum? Of course, the Europeans need to signal stability and not turn their back on the poorest of populations, on the most vulnerable populations, those who are exposed to climate change, also out of national interest, because there's many other groups who are taking advantage of people who are in precarious situations. These are organized crime groups, these are terrorist groups, and these are also states in which we are in a strategic cooperation with.
Do you see, you've mentioned sort of who steps in. Is it possible that China will see, and is there a geopolitical risk with China seeing the United States stepping back, that it steps in and can strengthen its already fairly strong position in developing countries?
Look, already on the African continent, China is playing a significant role in terms of supporting generally development, but then also where those gaps do exist. I found it quite interesting yesterday, to be honest, following the US Vice President's speech. Of course, the Foreign Minister of China then spoke, and the emphasis in his remarks were around working together, partnerships for better, development. And I found that quite an interesting contrast, because I think the signaling was there, which is the gaps that you create, we will find ways to fill them. Whether that will be to mutual benefit is something that we need to test and see. We've seen in contexts, particularly because Africa is richly endowed, particularly with critical minerals as well, we have seen that it hasn't always been that win-win. So it's one thing to say it's going to be win-win, it's another thing altogether to look on the ground and see those reflections. But if I may, there was a point that Kira made around, and Michael also made around the weaponization of food. And we can talk about big state actors, but I think it's really important for us to also recognize that for a lot of people on the ground, the entities they interact with mostly are the ones within their communities. I'll use two examples, then I'll end. In the Lake Chad Basin, we have seen Boko Haram using the price of fish as well as access to water and food to gain support in local communities. For those that don't know, Boko Haram is a violent extremist group operating in multiple countries in the Lake Chad Basin. In Somalia, we have seen Al-Shabaab do a similar thing, providing services, food, and security where the state is not able to do so. My concern is less whether an external actor fills a gap within the African continent. My concern is whether groups that are otherwise violent, criminal groups become the ones that are perceived by the society as ensuring more stability. That is dangerous, not just for Africa, but for the rest of the world, particularly our immediate neighbors.
And these groups are savvy enough that they can see that there's this gap and that they sort of step in, working through food aid as a way to, as you said, to build support.
Yes, they've been instrumentalizing for a long time. So when Michael speaks about Russia instrumentalizing or weaponizing rather food or grain supplies, particularly given that for a lot of countries, their primary source for wheat and corn were and continue to be Russia and Ukraine, this comes after. These activities that I'm speaking about by groups like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab precede these. These are, at least with Boko Haram, activities that they started in 2012.
And go ahead, what are the sort of, I'm also interested in, what are the, obviously that has huge implications for the regions affected by this sort of behavior. Does it also have spillover effects into the countries at large and then sort of regionally and globally as well?
I just want to mention that coming in on what you said, that it's not only food itself, it's also traditional livelihoods that are tied to the production of the food. And if these traditional livelihoods disappear because of climate change, because of lack of help with also modernizing parts of this livelihoods through irrigation systems, etc., then we have a situation in which people also lose their identity on top of their economic livelihood. And this then also makes them more vulnerable to terrorist recruitment by groups, as you have just mentioned. And I think it's very important to see these interconnections because, of course, if a whole region destabilizes, as we have seen tendencies in the Sahel as such, then this affects, of course, also other parts of this region and trade relationships, also displacement, internal and cross-border displacement. And it will affect also, for example, our own countries here in Europe, in Germany.
Great. Michael?
I wanted to come back to the geopolitical question that you were pushing with regard to China. I think it is too easy and also an oversimplification to make China the bogeyman. I live in Washington. It's all about China. And we make, I think, more of the threat of China than there actually is. There should be an argument for emerging countries, but also for other countries in the North, an argument of self-enlightened interest, that if you're under the illusion that you can live in a world with two food systems, one, simplistically speaking, in the North that works and one in the South that doesn't work, and you think you are going to live in a stable environment for the next 20 or 30 years, you are gravely mistaken. You live in a different world than I do. But the second point is also with regard to China. China hasn't been particularly good at creating win-win situations, especially in Africa. I mean, there's resentment vis-a-vis Africans, strong ideological formations within the Chinese development community, and a narrow definition of national Chinese interest. And China is, interestingly, so exposed to these shocks because food imports to China, even though the population growth is flatlining, have been growing by double digits every single year over the last decade. So China is extreme.
As it becomes richer and sort of changes the food mix that
they drink more milk, they eat more meat. If you want to have 1 gram of proteins in meat, you need 7 to 11 in plants to produce that meat. It's kind of a very consumption-driven increase of food imports. So China needs to figure out a way to stabilize a global system that China so far has no interest shown in stabilizing. And I feel that the lack of, shall we say, political creativity or flexibility in the Standing Committee among Chinese leadership will ultimately weaken China's position domestically, but also globally, because now with the collective retreat of the United States and the kind of redeployment of development and possibly military structures that the US had established globally, there will be a vacuum, and I don't feel that the Chinese leadership understands well enough that their narrowly defined national interests need to be broadened and embrace at least partially the global good and multilateral institutions and the freedom of trade and trade routes and a less militaristic foreign policy out of its own enlightened self-interest. So it's a very complicated situation, but China has so many domestic challenges and also operates by and large in a world with very few friends, if any at all, that I would not say this should be the only driving factor for the rest of the world to think about investing in agri-food systems that are sustainable, stable, and feed the several hundred million people that are starving right now.
So you sort of want the Chinese bogeyman to actually step up and...
I mean, out of their own interest, which is not mine, obviously, I would say yes, but I feel that the current leadership is not capable of doing that, which means that the coalitions of the willing that I mentioned before between enlightened countries in the north, a coalition between Asian and European actors, including Australia and the Indo-Pacific, and then hopefully the more open societies of the BRICS formation, India, South Africa, Brazil, possibly Mexico, they will have to play a more active role in the global environment. Otherwise, we will suffer very, very dire consequences collectively very, very soon.
The discussion we've had so far has focused very strongly on Africa. Is this, are the things that you're talking about, do they also apply to other emerging countries in Latin America, in Asia as well, or is Africa unique in that? How do these issues sort of percolate through in other regions?
Good question.
Look, a difficult question for me to answer because without sounding like a certain president, I'll say Africa first, but we see, and within the framework of the Munich Security Conference's Food Security Task Force, we have colleagues out of Asia, for example, who speak to very similar dynamics, perhaps differently, from a very different vantage point. But we see, for example, countries like India, that have a large growing population also needing to meet their needs and doing so where they can, collaborating. Then we see island states whose very existence is threatened by what we're talking about now around climate change or even livelihoods, and their need to invest in new, if they can, strategic partnerships. Now, I think there's a let's call it an elephant in the room or a silent elephant in the room, which is we keep referring to a changing global context, changing, ing, and I think we have to be quite frank and realize that we're living in a changed global context, that the kind of strategic partnerships, whether they are between Africa and Asia, Africa-Europe, Asia and Europe, including also the Middle East, these are critical partnerships that need to be developed where they weren't there, strengthened where they were. But this is not a discussion that is unique to the African continent by any measure. I mentioned Asia, but we also see similar dynamics, particularly in the Caribbean and also in South America as well.
Sure.
I just want to bring in one more global risk that may affect also industrialized countries, which is the scaling back of the US investment in climate change and Earth system observation, right? So if we look at the work of NOAA and look at the takedown of many of the websites already that is occurring, many of the data may be in peril in the future, we know less of what is going on. And with climate change, we know from the literature that multiple simultaneous breadbasket failures are possible. So that means that in multiple locations around the world, we may see massive crop failure in the future because of changes in the jet stream, for example. And we need very good observation data to be able to have these early warning systems so we know when to store food, we know when to estimate if there is an El Nino coming, we know, for example, when is onset and withdrawal of the Indian summer monsoon so the farmers can adapt accordingly. And this is, of course, reliant on global data, and the US is, of course, a very strong has been a very strong cornerstone of this global system. And if this is now strategically weakened, it makes us less prepared and makes us more vulnerable to these shocks. And this is also something that is very, very difficult to replace and strongly connected to the food security of the global population.
Can I just emphasize this, because what Kyrill just said is very important. This is a data-driven business, so to speak, and these data sets and the knowledge bases are absolutely crucial, and they need to be recovered and protected and preserved. Again, we are also living in a new era where there's a new quality. And again, Russia and Ukraine is an important example, because traditionally, if we talk about weaponization of food, we talk about starving people for military purposes, or the retention and acquisition of fighters for terrorist groups or insurgent groups. But if you look at what happened after the Ukraine invasion, virtually within hours, the commodity markets in Chicago reacted and prices went up. And then within weeks, a number of countries implemented often completely irrational food export and import restrictions. And so since only roughly 20% of wheat is traded globally, that amount shrunk, the price increased, and had immediate impacts in countries like Egypt, for example, where 30% of the caloric input of people daily is based on bread calories, where bread prices have been subsidized since the 1950s. The government couldn't maintain the subsidies any longer, and the political impact is immediate. So that's why I think food security is important. Climate security or climate change is the long-term challenge. Food is immediate. The impacts are right there in your face, and they create have the potential to create political instability. This is why this is so important, and it's interesting to see that there's a certain path convergence of the military sector talking a lot more about these issues, but also the development world and the development agencies thinking more about geopolitics, about foresight exercises, and about policy planning, because there's a path convergence that they're both basically meet at that nexus where climate, food, migration, regional stability, supply chains, and food supplies come together. This is the new world we are living in, and for that reason I feel food security is important, because to a degree it is a blueprint for 21st century foreign policy and security policy. In the 20th century, if you knew how many nuclear warheads were there on our and the Russian rockets in Europe, you were an expert, simplifying here. To understand the 21st century threats, you need to think about multi-layered, multi-dimensional systemic challenges that really require a lot more education, insights, and intellectual acumen. For that reason, I also would say this is a blueprint of how we will have to think about security, diplomacy, and development in the foreseeable future.
This is probably the final question, because we do have to end when President Zelensky starts his speech in a few minutes. Kira, you sort of touched on an issue of the American withdrawal. It's not just potential withdrawal from NATO, but it's sort of a withdrawal from the sort of Enlightenment scientific way of rational, evidence-based thinking. You've got their withdrawal from climate, from the Paris Climate Agreement. But then the whole scientific background is being pulled. The CDC is being gutted from various epidemic studies. RFK Jr. is now in charge of American health policy. The NIH grants are being slashed to American universities. Is the same way that Europe now has to do much more to fund its own defense? Is the rest of the world able to step in that gap that America has created and have the scientific and financial wherewithal to prevent a catastrophe? And if I could just get fairly short answers from you on that.
As the US government is doing what you just described, I also think that US philanthropies and not the federal state, but the individual states that are still very active in the green economy, for example, that they step up as well, right? So of course there's only limited what they can do, but I think especially private funds need also to flow from the US into certain initiatives to fill this gap. So it's not only the Europeans or other countries, but it's also other actors within the US. But yes, you are right. I think we need to signal stability, and we need to also communicate in other industrialized countries that this is in our national interest to exercise soft power also. And we have to step up our hard power. This has become very evident over the last years, unfortunately. But we also need to retain and ramp up our soft power as the US is tossing its soft power into the bin.
Michael, maybe?
The problem is it's not only about US soft power. What is often underestimated is that the US military has been a trailblazer in these conversations since the first Obama administration, since 2010, when this was incorporated into our national security strategy planning and thinking. Especially the US Navy has become, over the past 2 decades, a 911 emergency number for catastrophes, be it a tsunami in Indonesia or a hospital ship that you needed to send to Haiti after the earthquake. There's only one global infrastructure that can react within 24 hours to massive crisis, which is the US military and the US Navy specifically. And the problem is that if there's a reorientation and a withdrawal from the universal presence that the US had as a global stabilizer, sometimes with limited liability, some would say, that is exacerbating the issues that we're discussing here. It's not only development funding, it is also the stabilization part that the US military is in charge of.
Yeah.
Ottilia, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get you because I can see the clock relentlessly ticking down to the start of Zelensky's speech. Please stay on, and we're going to be broadcasting the Ukrainian president's speech on the main stage right here. Thank you very, very much for agreeing to take part in our panel today.